This is a story in a million. It's the story of a photographer who was able to capture Ottoman life in eastern Anatolia in the early 1900s. Before the Great War, before the genocide, before the lights were turned out on a civilization. It was April 2003. My father was ill. He was suffering from Alzheimer's, and my mother was looking after him. And she asked me to help clear out some of the things in her flat. And on opening one cupboard, I discovered this grey steel chubb box. And it dawned on me that this is a small treasure trove. In that steel box were close to about 100 glass plates, photographs of Arabkir, my grandfather's hometown. And it dawned on me that the actual place and time of these photographs were pre-genocide, pre-1915. It was fascinating to look at these pictures and go into this world that has long since been extinguished. What's remarkable about these glass plates is that they have mirrored the journey of my family over 3 generations and across numerous countries, Ottoman Turkey, Egypt, Sudan, England and the United States. These photographs depict a life, a community and a place that has long been lost. They've only surfaced now, a year short of the centennial of the Armenian genocide, and I want to share with you a few of those photographs to give you a flavour of what that life was like. This photograph that I've chosen is on the Euphrates River, a most important river in that part of the world. It's a biblical river. It's a river that flows all the way from the mountains of Ararat, north of Erzeroum, all the way through Anatolia, into Syria, Iraq, and out into the Persian Gulf. The 3 streams or tributaries that flow into the Euphrates in and around Arabkir are still the life source of Arabkir. One of the tributaries in Armenian was called Voske Kedag, which is Golden River. And the reason it was called Golden River is because it had lots of golden trout, which the locals used to fish, as they do today. Alongside the river, where you see this Roman viaduct, there is an identical looking viaduct in the same spot but taken on the other side of the viaduct in a book that was in that box called Arabkir by Antranik Paladian. The next plate is of houses in Arabkir on a mountain slope. This resonates with the description of Arabkir as a town surrounded on 3 sides by the Taurus Mountains. and houses dotted on all three sides as though it were a Roman amphitheatre. An Englishman called Frederick Barnaby travelled in 1876 on horseback. He was a captain in the British Army, and he travelled across Anatolia, and this is the description he had of Arabkir. The houses are built on each side of a deep ravine. The streets, which are very precipitous, lead in some instances over the flat roofs of the dwellings. The latter were, many of them, built of stone, and an air of cleanliness prevailed throughout the town. The size and layout of the town doesn't look that much different from what it was 100 years ago. And what I find interesting is that the population of Arabkir, which was 17,000 back in 1914, is still 17,000, but without the Armenians. Here we can see a poor Armenian family, ostensibly dressed in Ottoman clothing, as most poor Armenians dressed in at that time. This is a large family, and looking at this photograph, one gets a sense that they look reasonably comfortable, but not an easy life. I think their faces reflect that. In the next photograph, you will see a wealthier Armenian family dressed in European clothing. Naturally, life for the wealthier Armenians was much easier, whereas the poorer Armenians were effectively second-class citizens and would have had immense difficulties with the Ottoman officials.
Glass plates showing the shootings of Jerjian before 1915 is a fantastic collection. It is important and unique because such collection is preserved. It's preserved not for family members but all Armenian, because this is part of our common heritage and common legacy. This is part of our history, part of our memory. And every single shot which depicts people and the life in Western Armenia, it's like a puzzle, piece of puzzles, and piece by piece they enable us to recover the full imagination about life and all the interactions which happened in Western Armenia before 1915.
My grandfather, Dr. George Jerjian, the individual who took these photographs, was born in Arabkir in March 1870, the same year that Vladimir Lenin was born. He was the son of Joachim and Dove Jerjian. He was the fifth child of six. And being a bright individual, he ended up enrolling at the Sanasarian College in Erzeroum, which was some 3 weeks' travel away from Arabkir. And not only did he graduate from Sanasarian, but he ended up teaching there until the age of 25. At which point he managed to get a scholarship from the college to study natural sciences at Zurich Polytechnic for a doctorate. He was an outsider and hence away from the main body, the group. But 3 years later, as you can see in the photograph, he was centre stage. Clearly he had won over his friends and colleagues. Having graduated and before going back to his hometown, he purchased a camera. Having spoken to experts in cameras in those days, I'm told that for someone living in Switzerland at the time, in German-speaking Switzerland, they would have bought an Anhut's Goetz camera, which is shortened to Ango camera, and it would have been a field camera, which would have been light enough to travel. And being a chemist, he would have developed his own prints, hence these blueprints that we see. In 1900, he was back at Sanasarian College teaching, and for the following 7 years, until 1907, in the summers and holidays, he would go back home to Arabkir, where he would take photographs. So the question is, how did these plates survive the cataclysm of the First World War and the Armenian genocide? Well, in 1907, he left Ottoman Turkey with his belongings and these glass plates, and most likely his camera, and traveled to Alexandria, Egypt. He was offered a job by a successful trading family, the Kirchens, who were also natives of Arabkir. Whilst there, he naturally met one of the daughters of the Kirchen brothers, and they were married in 1909 at the United Presbyterian Church in Omdurman in Sudan. And they had 3 children, Arsène, Diana, and Edward, Edward being my father. My grandfather died in 1947 at the age of 77 in Alexandria, Egypt, where he's buried, and his belongings, including the glass plates, remained with his widow until 1956.
In 1956, my mother-in-law, Bargesh, came to Khartoum from Alexandria, Egypt, with a box full of glass plates and family photographs. She told me that her husband had taken photographs of his old hometown of Arabkir, and she had kept them in Alexandria for the last 50 years. Now she wanted Edward to keep it for our sons who carried the Jerjian name. Edward had them placed in a steel chop box, and it stayed with us in Khartoum for 20 years. In 1970, when we had troubles in Sudan, I moved to London, and Edward sent this box to me, and it has been here for the past 30 years, until George found a new home for them.
Having access to these photographs and allowing others to have access to these photographs has allowed us to analyze and realize what the contents of these photographs are about. And I think that we're just really touching the surface at this point. Over time, with Armenian, Turkish, and American sources, we'll be able to drill down into these photographs and have a more enriched evaluation of them.
It's typically regarded a miracle if there's a dozen pictures of an Armenian town before its destruction. There may be photographs taken after its ruination, but to have intact photographs of an intact town before there was any sense that this place would simply be wiped out really is quite remarkable. Therefore, the Georgian collection is really more than a snapshot of what life was like more than 100 years ago, far before the First World War and the Armenian genocide clearly wiped away all Armenian life in that part of the world. Arabkir, incidentally, was a city that had Armenian presence for a very, very long time. It's on the Euphrates River, and this is an area where Armenians had been living for thousands of years. So we're looking at the last moments, the last years of an ancient community that is about to become extinct. Today, of course, for scholars, it's a treasure trove of information. Each photograph is like a book into the life of that era. And therefore, I'm convinced that scholars will be examining them for a very long time.
One of the glass plates shows the Cathedral of the Holy Mother of God, or Surp Asvazadzin. And it's important to note the Arabkir Cathedral was huge. It could take between 3,000 and 4,000 people. It was one of the largest cathedrals in Anatolia. What's interesting is that Arabkir was not the largest Armenian populated city. Erzeroum and Van were far larger, but they had no cathedral of this size. There's also an interior shot of the cathedral in one of the slides, again, never before seen. In the late 1950s, the Turkish authorities had the cathedral demolished with explosives. I suspect that the cathedral, being the size it was, imposing on the town, was an unwelcome reminder of the Armenian past of the town. And today, all that's left is a field with ruins of the cathedral. The next slide is a photograph of two Armenian priests. The hats they are wearing show that they are married priests. Now, we know from a writer in the original Arabkir book, which I've transcribed onto the English version, a man by the name of Karnig Yegavian, who was an Armenian living in the Sudan, wrote of his early days in Arabkir. And he mentions three priests by the names of Varshag, Koryun, and Tornig. The first two were arrested, tortured, and killed in May 1915. And the third one, Tornig, converted to Islam to save his life and his family's life, and married off his daughter and granddaughter to Turks, but passed away 3 months later, causes unknown. For me, this is a detective story, really. It's, I find it captivating to find out in this photograph, these two priests. Was one of these two Tornig? In a 1901 annual report by the Patriarchate of Constantinople for Arabkir, the following figures relating to schools are mentioned. 18 schools, but in fact, most of them were probably very small little houses that taught students. They weren't proper schools as we would know them today or recognize them today. There were effectively 5 main schools: the college and St. Nishan, Krikorian, and Yegavian schools amongst them. And there were 2 girls' schools, Zaruhan and Hanesian schools, which taught up to 120 girls, which is amazing for that time and that place. Of all the Armenian schools that were standing at the dawn of the First World War, we don't know how many of them are still in existence, but we have been reliably informed that this one school was this one building was an Armenian school in the past, but we don't know what its use is today. On looking at this photograph of these young girls with their mistress in the middle, who looks stern but not austere, the girls themselves look happy and bright. Their faces are shining, and that's what I love about this photograph. More specifically, the reason it's bizarre seeing this photograph is because they're being educated in an Ottoman country, an Ottoman state, in a Muslim state, where education of women was not a priority by any stretch of the imagination. The significance of these photographs in depicting pre-genocide Armenian life in Ottoman Turkey is still unfolding and is drawing international interest.
The Georgian collection is one of the most unusual sets of photographs that's been uncovered. The fact that the collection has such dimensions in terms of the social, economic, cultural facets of the information that is preserved in there, and most of them are portraits of people, creates or recreates a panoramic view of society at that time. We have a way of understanding what people looked like, how they behaved, how they were dressing, what professions they were practicing. There's the whole range of the social classes, of the social types, possibly even the variety of the ethnic composition of that town. Armenians, Turks, and others, Christians and Muslims, were living together in these cities in the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century. So from the historian's perspective, here was a window that had never been opened before, and suddenly here was a world that we could look at and begin to imagine an entire city, an entire community as it existed before its utter destruction, its utter ruination. From that standpoint, it's truly like a searchlight upon a darkened world.
This next photograph is a scene in Arabkir center on a main thoroughfare. It's a Dervish procession, and it's in the early 1900s, and I'm told by one ethnographer that this is actually a Muslim circumcision procession. It showed, if you like, the panoply of races and religions that populated the Ottoman Empire and lived reasonably harmoniously at that time. It's amazing looking at this photo of Arabkir in the early 1900s and comparing it to 100 years later, the changes and advances that have happened to the town. You know, seeing the mules and horses replaced by trucks and cars, seeing the markets evolving from what would have been stalls under a canopy to shops on a high street now and mini-marts. In this photograph of the master tailor with his apprentices, I think this is a really lovely photograph. Clearly it's been staged because every single student or apprentice is doing something, weaving, cutting, or whatever it is they do, and the tailor himself is cutting a cloth. So clearly a staged photograph, but nonetheless very sweet. All the apprentices, these young boys, probably didn't go to school, and instead of going to school they went to learn a trade. They're all wearing a fez and pretty much the same clothes as a uniform. Looking at Arabkir today at a tailor's, whereas in the past they would have had dozens of apprentices working with them, you'll find one tailor doing the work on their own with no apprentices. This photograph of these Ottoman officials all lined up, not just on ground level, but even upstairs on the second floor, they're all lined up to be photographed. I suspect, given the volume of Ottoman officials and the large building, it's more likely to have been taken in Erzeroum. Erzeroum was a large city, and it still is a large city today, and had a large Armenian population. It was a pivotal place, not just for Ottoman Turkey, but even today Erzeroum is known in NATO as the Rock, because it's so close to the former Soviet Union. What's also interesting is in this particular photograph, on the left side, there is an imam, that's a Muslim cleric, and an Armenian Catholic priest. I note the absence of Armenian Orthodox priests here, which I am reliably told this must have been taken in around 1908, 1909, after the Young Turk Revolution opened up conversations between different races and different religions within the Ottoman Empire. This is the last photograph of the selection I've made, and probably my favorite, and it would be because it's about the Jerjian clan, and it has my grandfather in it. My grandfather is second from the left, dressed impeccably, with that wonderful handlebar moustache. Next to him, I am certain it's got to be one of his sisters, and probably his elder sister, Pepperon. The other three individuals definitively look and have the Georgian DNA. The gentleman on the far right, with the watch and the waistcoat, looks remarkably like my late young brother Simon. Next to him is a younger fellow with a moustache and a fez, and he looks like a younger version of my dad. So there it is, the Georgian clan gathering. It was in early January 2014 that I managed to take all these glass plates to Chicago Album Works in Massachusetts, who are the foremost leaders in developing the glass plates into digital copies. And we've now been able to pass these on to several museums, namely the Armenian Genocide Museum in Yerevan, secondly the Armenian Museum of America in Boston, the AGBU, that's the Armenian General Benevolent Union in New York, who will be disseminating this across 36 chapters worldwide. And lastly, the Armenian National Institute in Washington, D.C. The originals of all these glass plates and all the material relating to my grandfather are being donated to the Armenian Genocide Museum in Yerevan. And now that we've got these glass plates transformed into digital format, we know that they will survive forever. These glass plates have traversed oceans and continents, countries and generations, and today, after a century of darkness, they have seen daylight. It's extraordinary to think the journey that these glass plates have made and emerged on the other side intact, to tell their story and the story of my grandfather, Dr. George Jerjian.